Well, good evening. It's good to see everyone this evening. Good to be together and look forward to our study together. We're starting in the book of Genesis this evening, and we're going to be looking at the early human history of all mankind, not just a certain particular group, but we'll get into that later on in the book of Genesis. But we're looking at the early history of all mankind, beginning with, of course, the creation. And the reason we had chosen this study of Genesis and to go through these over the next few weeks is we're going to be looking at foundations. And if we can understand our foundations, then that makes it easier for us to understand perspective of where we are today. And so as we go through this study, feel free to comment, ask questions, however you'd like. And if you're either on Facebook, YouTube, or any platform that you are viewing this on, feel free to comment, send us text if you don't have a Facebook or anything like that, and we can try to answer those questions best we can. We're going to be doing a lot of fly through this evening, and so understand that we can't go into everything deeply, but we look forward to getting into some things and, again, laying some foundation of our beginnings. Before we get started, want to thank Stephen and Marshall for joining me in this particular study and, of course, going on with the rest of it, and look forward to that with you guys. So it starts off in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And this almost works as almost a theme text for the rest of the Bible. That you have all your major characters set, mainly the main character of God, who at the very beginning, implying an end, created everything. Now, that idea of creation really carries throughout the rest of the Bible, that it is the essence of what our salvation is all about. Creation and salvation go hand in hand. We are a new creation created in Christ for good works. And so you can see how that carries through from the beginning to the end of the scriptures, the idea of we are created. Well, it starts here in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. And the creation account is very simple as far as the structure goes. We have 7 days of a week. And of course, you have the 6 days of creation with a seventh day of rest in God. And so you have the creation and the idea of that these separations between these days. The first 3 days, you have separations. You have the separation of light and darkness, that is day and night. On the second day, you have the separation of waters above and the waters below. On the third day, you have the separations of seas and dry ground. And then on the fourth through sixth day, you have God filling all of those days where he had separation. And so day 4, you are filling the first day with sun, moon, with sun, moon, and stars for the light and the darkness. You have day 5 filling the waters above and the waters below with birds and sea creatures of all kinds. And you have the 6th day that fills in the seas and the dry ground with animals and especially with man. And that idea of mankind, this pinnacle of creation, is what Marshall is going to speak to us about for just a few moments here. Oh, we've lost
in Genesis.
Okay,
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Sorry. In Genesis chapter 1, you have man as the final creation of God. In verses 26 and 27, it talks about God saying, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." And then it says that God made man in his own image, according to his own likeness. He created man in his own image, male and female. He created them. And you see kind of a zoom in when you get to chapter 2, in that Adam is created from the dust of the ground, but is yet still in the image of God. And then woman is made out of man. And so man is kind of the crowning jewel of God's creation, if you will. Adam is formed first, then Eve. Both men and women are created in the image of God. But what does this mean to be made in the image of God? And let me just hand it off real quick, if I can, to Colton. I know you've done some study on the image of God. And so do you mind just saying a quick word about what that involves?
So there's a lot of different ideas as to what it could mean, but I really see that it has the potential of being defined in two ways. One is the idea of that we are representations or representatives of God. And you see this being carried through whenever you see that Christ is the image of God. And you see in Romans chapter 8 that we are made in the image of Christ. And so you see that it is a representation. We are representatives of Christ. That's one option. The other option is in the immediate context of Genesis, the idea that man has dominion over the earth. And so rule is another idea of what this could potentially mean, the image of God. I see no reason why to not assume that actually both are at play, that we are representatives of God, and especially maybe even in this passage, that we are representatives in that we have dominion over the earth. Just as God has dominion over us, we represent that dominion to all the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, that order of creation, that concept of authority, is not only for men and women over the animals, but it also says something about gender and gender roles and marriage, and that man being created first, Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 2, means that he is in a role of authority, a position of authority over the woman, over his wife, and yet the two complement one another. It's not like man is just the better creation, because the woman is created to be comparable to him, a helper who will help him in his assigned task of managing the creation, co-reigning over the creation, if you will. And thus, I think whenever we talk about the concepts like the gender roles, marriage, it has to be firmly rooted in Genesis chapter 1. Man is the leader, woman is the helper. Marriage is for one man and one woman for life. But moving beyond that, when you think about the roles that have been assigned, the mission that's been given to him, there's great significance given to man, and he has a specific purpose to fill. God is given mankind stewardship, authority over his creation, but the superiority of humanity doesn't suggest that we can abuse that privilege, but we are to act like God. We are to rule in a benevolent way over the creation, subdue it, and use it for good. And as we have authority over animals and plants, that's demonstrated very clearly in Genesis 1 and 2, and Adam naming them. I think that also shows his authority over a woman, because he names the woman just as God names the man and also names various aspects of the creation. And so mankind is to represent God in the world. God works, man works. God rules, man rules. God connects with man, and man connects with God. All of these are firmly rooted in the first couple of chapters of Genesis. And yet there are some people who doubt the historical nature of this, that there was actually a historical Adam. And Stephen, why don't you talk a little bit about the popular beliefs about the origins of the universe and how that doesn't fit into this story?
Yeah. So when we start talking about how everything began, what Moses does here is give us a very straightforward explanation of that. The terminology doesn't seem mythological. It doesn't seem steeped in sort of veiled language, but rather a rather straightforward point by point. He does use language to describe each day that we would use, whether it's that each day is day and night, and that is one day. It's the same timekeeping we would use to refer to that. But I think even more important than that are the references that continue to be made back to creation throughout the rest of Scripture. Whether it's, for instance, the Sabbath law referring to the 6 days. On the sixth day, well, of course, the sixth day of the Sabbath law is literal, and it is tied to the 6 days of creation. But then, in addition to that, we have the genealogies that take us from here at the creation story in Adam to the next characters. And so at what point in that genealogy do we go from non-historical to historical? Those genealogies get us all the way to Jesus. As we look at Luke in particular, it takes us all the way back to Adam to show the humanity of Jesus. And so at what point does that, does that genealogy become non-literal? And I think it is rather arbitrary. And somebody might say, Couldn't God have created the world and made everything through evolution? Sure. That's just not how he said he did it. So I'm going to just take him at his word and continue to put my trust in what God's word has to say about that. So I think, as we think about that, a lot of people try to fit what the world is saying, and it's really a world who's rejected the scriptures. And I think what we're trying to do is sort of come to some sort of peace with people who have already rejected this out of hand. And we've got to continue to be people who receive this while the rest of the world rejects it. Along with that, as we're reading through this first section here in the first few chapters, we have creation. And of course, creation very quickly bleeds over into, we have chapter 2 kind of giving us a sense of what it's like to be in the garden. Then chapter 3 is the fall, and very quickly they lose access to that utopia, the only utopia that's ever existed on the earth. And one of the major parts of that, as you get to the end of chapter 3, is that it says that they lost access to the tree of life. He put a cherubim, it says, with a flaming sword. This is God, put a cherubim with a flaming sword, which turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. And so Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden. They lose access to the tree of life, and it's because they sought access to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so I just make a couple of points there. And one is that here is a tree with the knowledge of good and evil, which seems to us to be the kind of knowledge that would be valuable. It's a good thing to know the difference between good and evil. But I think what God did is set a choice up for Adam and Eve to seek out that knowledge on their own, or to continue to trust in him as the source of that knowledge. And going back to something Colton said, being made in the image of God, there in chapter 3, Satan's temptation is, if you do this, you will be like God. God, on the other end of that, later in chapter 3, says they will become like us. And I think that the recognition of that is they are the arbiters of what is right and wrong for themselves. And that is how we make gods out of ourselves. So by seeking knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil on their own terms, they wrest control away from God and therefore break the relationship with God. But the other aspect of that, just very quickly, here they lose access to the tree of life over in Revelation chapter 22, at the very end of the Bible. So at the beginning of the Bible, we have the tree of life, losing that. At the end of scriptures in Revelation 22 and verse 1, it says there, "Then he showed me a river of the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and of the Lamb. And in the middle of its street, on either side of the river, was the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. And there will no longer be any curse. And the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his bondservants will serve him." And so we lost access to the tree of life. There was a curse pronounced. Here in Revelation 22, the tree of life is accessible once again, and there is no curse. And so I think that helps us to see the unity of the story of Scripture, how it begins with a concept, and we lose that, and then the reconciliation of that at the end. But of course, losing that is a result of sin and the consequences of that. And so as we look at that here in chapter 3, Marshall, why don't you tell us a little bit about what God has to say about sin entering in?
And so obviously, for those of us that are Christians, have read the Old Testament, read the New Testament, we know sin is really the heart of the problem, and it finds its origin there in Genesis chapter 3. But sin basically is when I do what is wrong or I don't do what's right. James chapter 1, James chapter 4. But what that creates is the necessity of a holy God in his justice punishing that sin. And so the wages of sin is death. It's a separation from God. And that's what they experienced. And we see that in physical terms and in spiritual terms in Genesis 3. But they were literally cast out of paradise, cast out of the garden. And in a very real sense, we continuing in sin after Adam and Eve are separating ourselves from God. We are stepping away from him as we try to do things on our own. And just as they were ashamed because of their sin, they realized their nakedness, and they were ashamed. They didn't want God to see them. So we are ashamed based on our sin. When we knowingly do what is wrong, we separate ourselves from God. And so you see here a spiritual death occurring, a separation from God, but also there's a physical death. And we see in Romans chapter 5 that Adam brought death into this world. I think that's probably talking about physical death as you compare that to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And so physical death is here. We experience it as we are separated from the tree of life that's already been mentioned. And so death is the problem. It is a result, it's a consequence of sin. And yet, for those of us that are Christians, we know the end of the story is it doesn't stop in Genesis 3. Death continues, but there's a time when Jesus comes and he overcomes death, and he's going to fully and finally overcome death at Resurrection Day. When he comes again, he's going to give us life so that we don't suffer death. And that's the real issue here, is God doesn't want us to suffer eternal death, sometimes called the second death in Revelation chapter 20, where we are separated from him eternally, cast into the lake of fire. You know, Jesus said in John chapter 8 and verse number 21, if we die in our sins, we can't go where he was going, that is to heaven itself. God doesn't want that to happen. And so in Genesis 3, you even see God's promise that sin and death are not going to be permanent, because Satan is going to be destroyed. I'm not going to step onto Colton's material talking about the curses, but Genesis 3:15 is talking about how God is offering hope to sinful creatures, that he is going to overcome death in Jesus Christ. Because of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, we have hope of resurrection from our spiritual and physical death someday. And while Eden is a picture of eternal life, a picture of paradise, and Stephen already pointed that out at the end of Revelation, that we're looking to get back to the tree of life, I would suggest, maybe just nuancing that a little bit, that Eden is just a picture of the ultimate reality, and that we're not looking for earthly Eden. We're not looking for a renewed Eden here on earth. What we're looking for is to follow Jesus into the true paradise, into heaven itself, to be in the presence of God. And that only happens because he has put an end to sin and death by being the fulfillment of Genesis 3:15. So since I've already kind of stepped on the curses, let me hand it over to Colton so he can tell us a little bit more about that.
And really, I think just intuitively, we sometimes just assume that there's actually 3 curses here, but really there's only 2 curses that happen here. You have the curse against the serpent himself, and this is the only curse that you have against a person until you get to the next generation with Cain. And then you have a curse of the ground. So you have the curse of the serpent and the curse of the ground. Now, the curse against the serpent is that he will become the most worthless of all beasts. And of course, God is talking about more than the snake is literally the worst of all animals, though some people might argue for that. But that he, as Satan, is the worst of all creation. He has made himself to be the most fallen of all creation. And so you have that he curses him directly. And that curse certainly continues throughout all of the scriptures. But the punishment comes on both of them, or on all 3 of them, I should say. The punishment comes on all 3 of them. The first punishment, as Marshall was touching on, that you have that Satan will eventually be entirely destroyed, that he will have his head entirely crushed. And so he will be ultimately destroyed. Now, the way that comes about is through the punishment that is given to the woman. And so even though there will be some sort of vindication of man from this event, for the woman specifically, she has to go through some amount of pain in order to get there. And so that's the punishment that he gives to the woman. And I think this is what's involved. Marshall had referenced 1 Timothy chapter 2 earlier in verses about 11 through 14, but then it concludes in verse 15 talking about that she will be saved in childbearing. And I think that's the idea going all the way back to the garden, that it's sending us back to the garden saying that her salvation, the salvation of woman, is through childbearing. And the way that the Christ came to be on this earth was through a woman, as Galatians even tells us as well, and makes a point about that. And so we have that it is through this painful experience that salvation comes to all women and all men, of course, as well. But it is through that painful process that's going to get them there. Now, the second curse is the curse of the ground. And that also shows that even for man as well, that he has to go through some amount of pain in order to have some amount of hope. And so that dominion that he had over the earth, the labor that was supposed to be something that was pleasant and easy for him, now becomes a burden. It becomes a hardship because God has cursed the ground that thorns and thistles come. But this, again, pushes man to want something better than this world, to want something more than what even Eden can offer, as Marshall was referencing earlier. And so these thorns and thistles, coincidence? I don't really think so. That the king of sinners was the one that wore thorns and thistles on his brow as he was dying for all those sinners that they might be saved. I believe you have a connection there of binding those things together to show that Christ is the ultimate salvation of both man and woman. And I believe we see this in these first few chapters of Genesis, early references to Jesus. And so these curses, as Stephen and Marshall have both referenced, the curse, there will be no more curse in the end. So even if we do experience some amount of these same pains that Adam and Eve went through after being ejected out of the garden, even still, we will know that one day all the curse will be lifted. There will be no more curse against us. Now, before we move into the next section, I want to make sure that we don't skip over anything. So did anyone have any particular questions that you saw before we move into our next section here about Adam's offspring or Adam's children?
There wasn't anything on my side.
Okay. All right. So we come into the next generation, and this is with Cain and Abel, and I'll let Stephen take us from there.
Yeah, so coming into chapter 4, we have the story of Cain and Abel laid out for us. And it is the first division between men on one side serving God, on the other side not. Certainly on one side being more pleasing to God and the other side less pleasing to God. And in the New Testament, in Hebrews chapter 11, it points back to Abel as the first in a long list of names of people who are considered faithful. Now, it doesn't say anything about Abel being faithful here in this particular text. It just says that his offering was pleasing to God. There's something that we can learn right from the very beginning there, is that when people are pleasing to God, it's because they're responding in belief to something God has said. And so even though it doesn't tell us that God has explained what he wants and what he doesn't want, I think there's a foundation here. We can assume it. We can assume that God, just as he's revealed to us, that he revealed to men throughout the ages what he wanted from them and what he did not want from them. And so as we go down through the text, Abel certainly was responsive to that. Cain less responsive to that. Maybe even rebellious to that to some degree, and that caused jealousy. Instead of it causing some motivation for Cain to want to do better, it's jealousy. That jealousy grows, and of course the result is that Cain, of course, killed his brother Abel, and Abel becomes the first martyr, if you will, to serving God, and would be the first in a long line, and he would be referenced in that instance as well. But in looking at that, talking about the murder that's occurring here and the sin that's occurring here, the death and the curse, the subsequent curse of Cain, and how this ties into what we've been looking at already, Marshall, what connections do you see there?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about the curse in just a minute, but I think in your reference to the narrative, you kind of laid out what Cain has done, what he did in that story. But right in the middle of it, it says in chapter 4 and verse 7 that God gives him a warning. Do you mind touching on that before I talk about the curse?
Yeah. So in that warning, he comes to him in verse 7, as Marshall mentioned, if you do well, this is God speaking to Cain, if you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. When you look at that idea there, first of all, he says, if you do well, then things will be better for you, right? And then secondly, he says the potential for sin is right there. But where's the responsibility? He says, you must master it. The Bible does not use the word free will explicitly. They don't say man has free will. But all through the scriptures, and here is a very pointed place, God says to men, you have to make a choice. And here is not even the first, maybe it's a little bit more explicit, but Adam and Eve had a choice. Now Cain has a choice. What will you do with this? And of course, what he did was yield, but the choice was there. And God doesn't say, you can't help it, I'll be the one making the choice. He says, it's up to you. And so I think that's a very powerful thing in that story having to do with sin. But coming back to the consequences there, Marshall.
Yeah, and so there's two principles that I see there. Is one that you laid out, that sin is a choice, but the other is that sin always results in a curse. You know, we've already seen that. Adam and Eve sin, curse. Cain sins, curse. And the curse is that he's going to be cast away from his family in essence, and he's going to be a vagabond on the earth. It's not going to be good for him because of what he has done. And in that curse, it says that God's going to, in a sense, protect Cain from someone killing him by putting a mark on Cain. What that mark is, I don't know specifically. But again, the point is that sin results in a curse, and God is going to punish those who are wicked. And tying it back to Abel, God is avenging Abel by punishing his murderer, Cain. And so the only way that all curses that are a result of sin can come about is, as we've already talked about, by Christ coming and becoming a curse so that the curse of sin could be lifted. And again, you have that choice, but as we give in to sin, just like Cain gave in to sin, you know, he could have turned back to God. But again, his rebellious heart, he keeps pushing farther and further away from God. Whereas we as sinners are again given that choice. If Jesus is willing to take the curse, are we willing to come to him? And so that's a choice we all have to make. I think that's an important lesson we can take from Cain. Just as John says, you know, don't be like Cain. You know, you need to be a faithful person, a loving person. And that again comes to our choice to serve God. So Colton, let me hand it off to you. Go ahead.
Well, before I move into the genealogy, before we move into the flood, I find it interesting that little did Adam and Eve know that whenever they sinned and they knew that death, physical death, was yet to come, that the first death that they were going to experience was the death of their innocent son at the hands of their guilty son. And that's just sobering to think of that from a parent's perspective, that they in some way caused this.
And
but go ahead.
I was just going to say, and as you already made some tie-ins, you know, that's what God did for us with Christ. His innocent son suffered death.
And just to throw in one more thing, going back to the point of the choice, it says that when God pronounced the curse that you spoke of there, and but if you look at verse 14, Cain says, verse 13, my punishment is too great to bear. Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and from your face I will be hidden. God did not pronounce that. And so one of the things that I think we see is that Cain chooses more disfellowship from God. In other words, there could have been an opportunity there for Cain to learn, for Cain to come back to God. But as is so often the case, when people sin and sever the relationship, they choose to sever the relationship even further. And I think Cain did that as well. So we see him continuing in those choices that drive him away. But coming back there then to the genealogies, Colton.
So, of course, genealogies were so important to the Jewish people. And so this would have been so vital for them to be able to trace their lineage back in any way, however it may have been. And you actually see a very similar genealogy such as this being used in the Gospels to talk about and show that Jesus was the Son of God, it's being through the son of Adam. And you see this passing along of the image of God that we were talking about earlier. You see this in chapter 5 and in verse 2 where it says, or in verse 3 where it says, when Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. So you see a handing down of the image, but you also see a handing down of the image even over in chapter 9 and verse 6, where we'll get to later, to show that all people continue to represent God and his rule on this earth, even though they were not the first creation, of course. And so you have these genealogies being used, and you see this constant, they lived, then they died. They lived, then they died. They lived, then they died. Then, you come to Enoch. And so the implication here is that this genealogy shows that all of these people continued over and over again in sin. And the more sin continued, the more death continued. And the only way that you can stop the cycle of death is to stop the cycle of sin. And that is how Enoch was able to not, is all that it says. He was not, where it usually would say, and he died. He was not, and God took him, for Enoch walked with God, which will tie us in with Noah here in just a moment. But you have that Enoch broke the cycle of death by being a man who was blameless according to sin. And so that's what makes him astounding in this context. But as well, you see that people actually had this same idea of calling on God for salvation. You back up into chapter 4 in the last verse, it says, amidst these families that in the days of Enosh, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. You see this being used throughout the scriptures, that it's not just the idea of prayer, but it's the idea of prayer for mercy, begging God for salvation. You see this in Joel chapter 2, which is quoted in Acts chapter 2, along with being referenced in Acts chapter 22, along with being referenced and even quoted in Romans chapter 10, that baptism, confession, these are ways that we call upon the name of the Lord for salvation. And these people were doing just the same, starting at least in the days of Enosh, that they recognized their sinfulness and that they needed God for mercy. And so that leads us, this idea, this genealogy puts us straight into the days of Noah, which of course is with the flood account. And probably most of us are familiar with the flood. Noah is told that he needs to build an ark, and for 40 days and 40 nights, they were within this boat as it was raining throughout all that time. After 150 days of the waters prevailing, you have that finally the waters begin to subside. And so over a period of, in total, from the time that it started to rain to the end, about a year and 10 days, depending on what calendar you're talking about, there's at least 300 days that you have this flood going from start to finish, that finally the waters go away and you have dry land. And we can know that, perhaps if I can throw this in for just a side note, we can know that this was a worldwide flood because of chapter 7 and verse 20. In Genesis chapter 7 and verse 20, it says, the waters prevailed 15 cubits higher and the mountains were covered. So you have that if the mountains are covered up to at least 20 feet above where the mountains were, this has got to be a worldwide flood. This has got to be a total covering of the earth. Before I come back for just a moment, I did get a question over here, and if you guys got a question, go ahead and throw those as well. But Julia, you had asked, are you saying that Enoch didn't sin? I'm not saying Enoch didn't sin, but he was a man who was blameless much more than anyone who was surrounding. So in the same way that an elder can be blameless, that he can be without sin, in the sense of that you cannot accuse him of wrong. He is a good and upright man. He follows God in the way that he should, is the same way that I was referring to Enoch there. But it does almost make a precursor to Christ, who would actually be entirely sinless. So, did anyone else have questions before we continue on with the flood? Okay. And so one of the questions that we have to answer is, so why did God decide to destroy the world with a flood? What was the problem that was involved with this generation of people? And of course, primarily the problem is sin. There's maybe some hints as to what particular sins are involved. You have that in chapter 6 and verse 4, that there seems to be some sort of sexual sins that are going on, whatever those may be, whatever the discussion about the sons of God, whatever that discussion means. We at least can see that there's some form of sexual sin that is taking place here. You have in chapter 6 and verse 11 that one of the primary reasons God destroys people throughout the Genesis account and throughout history, throughout the Old Testament, is because of violence. And you have that here in this passage as well. Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. And this was the totality of who they were. And in fact, no matter what sins are involved here, and I think there were probably many sins that were involved here because of chapter 6 and verse 5. And this is the key passage that shows why God decided to destroy the world. It says, "And the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." How detestable of a state that you have an entire generation of people that the only thing they ever think about is sin. And I don't even know if we can imagine a generation that bad. And that perhaps gives us more clarification. Many people would try to say, well, how God, and he's not being fair by destroying the world, even though there were some good people. We're talking about at the most 8 souls that were good out of an entire world of entire debauchery and wickedness. And not even their thoughts were pure in any of this. And so there is definitely justification of God for bringing this destruction. And so, Marshall, if you'll kind of talk a little bit more about maybe stepping back for a moment about Noah and his place in all this situation and the ark, perhaps.
Yep. Well, Noah found grace. And so in the midst of this terrible, terrible world, there was a man who experienced the grace of God. And it was not that God just selected this evil, wicked man out of a whole host of wicked. It's because Noah had a heart for God. He responded in faith, Hebrews chapter 11. And that faith led him not only to believe, but also to act. And so instead of having evil thoughts and evil actions, Noah is a man who has has faith and faithful actions. And the writer of Hebrews says that faithful action was that he did what God said to do, build an ark for the saving of his household. Now, that did a couple of things. It condemned the world. The world didn't like hearing that judgment was coming. And as he was building this ark, this basically said, I'm obeying God and you're not. And in a sense, I think he was constantly trying to get people to respond to the Lord, but they were not responsive. And yet Noah, twice it says, at least twice, it says he did everything according to all that God had commanded him. And so obedience was definitely a necessity in this. that he had to respond not only with belief, but also with action. So Noah was saved by grace through faith, and that faith involved action. And he fully obeyed the Lord. This also tells us that you have to obey specifically, because God said, specific type of material, gopher wood, specific dimensions, specific design. I want you to build it exactly like this. And Noah said, yes. He didn't say, well, don't you think it'd be better to do it this way or that way? He said, yes, whatever you say, that's what I'm going to do. That is a person of faith. Someone who doesn't make excuses, someone who doesn't try to skirt around God's commands. It says, I'm going to do whatever God says to do. And that's why Noah is held up as a faithful man, not only in his generation, but also as an application for all generations when you get to the New Testament. Over and over again, the story of Noah and the flood come up. For instance, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7, 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5 proves that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. He was a man who lived by faith in the midst of a sinful world, and that led to persecution. Because Peter makes the application, if he could save Noah out of the hands of the ungodly, so he can save us out of the hands of the ungodly if we respond to God in faith and obedience. So that judgment motif continues in Matthew 24 and Luke chapter 17, where Jesus is talking about destruction of Jerusalem, and then he seems to shift into the final judgment, and he says it's going to be like the days of Noah. Now, Noah was prepared. He may not have known exactly the day when God was going to shut the door until God said, hey, we're done, go inside. But he was telling people throughout those years of preparation, you've got to get ready because God is coming. And you may not know when, but you got to be ready. And that's exactly the application Jesus makes. You don't know when he's coming again, so you need to be ready. You see something similar. The flood story is referenced again in 2 Peter chapter 3. We don't have time to get into that, but again, that idea of be ready, live righteously, because the end is coming. And then one of the really interesting points that is made in 1 Peter chapter 3 about the Noah story is that it was, yes, he was saved by the grace of God. Yes, he was saved by faith, but he was also saved through water. And the writer, Peter, makes the point, that's the same as us. It is the resurrection of Jesus that saves us. Read the end of verse 21. But 1 Peter 3:21 says, it corresponds to Noah's salvation. Baptism now saves you. Not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience. And again, that's through the resurrection of Jesus. So Noah is an example of a man of faith. It was grace that saved him. It was faith that saved him. It was water that saved him. All those work together in order to get this man ready for the flood. All of these will work together for us to get us ready for the judgment day. And Noah and his family were saved, and they came out the other side as in a new creation. Stephen, you want to talk about what happens in that new creation? Sacrifice and fellowship?
Yeah, so just real quickly, let me add a comment that Rachel Neely put down in reference in something we mentioned earlier. Adam living not only to see the consequences of their sin in the next generation, but as you look at the length of their lives, they would have continued to see that progression on down through the generation of Noah. And so they could have watched the whole thing. And it wasn't just that they immediately saw consequences, but can you imagine living, we suffer when we see consequences over, the measure of our lives. But so much more as they would watch it go over the measure of their lives.
And real quick,
yeah.
I did get a question on my side that maybe you could address, or someone, Colton. Did the curse of Cain end after the flood?
I don't think the family of Cain survives the flood. So, I would say simply, it would have had to. Coming out of the ark in chapter 8, it tells us essentially the first thing that is done here at the end of chapter 8, verse 20. It says, Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered a burnt offering on the altar. And the Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. And so he makes promises regarding the seasons and so forth. The idea of sacrifice and our relationship with God being formed through sacrifice, that is because of sin. As we go back to the Garden of Eden, the relationship is there without sacrifice. But after sin, in chapter 3, we get a nice, I say a nice, it's a frightening, but we get, I think, a good picture of a literal representation of what sacrifice can do. Here, their nakedness is revealed, their shame is revealed because of their sin in chapter 3. And what God does is make coverings for them out of animal skins. And so right there we have a sacrifice. What does it do? It covers up the shame of the people so that they can be in fellowship with God. And you might just think of it in those kinds of terms that if we're exposed, we can't keep company while we're exposed. We have to cover ourselves up. And so the blood is something that, we can't. In Adam and Eve's case, they didn't have a way to cover themselves. They tried, it was insufficient. And God said, here's a way to cover yourself. Well, the same thing with all of our sin. It exposes us, it shames us, and there's nothing we can do to cover it up. We can try, but all of our efforts are poor efforts. And so sacrifice is what makes fellowship possible. And even with a good man like Noah, their sacrifice, that goes back to that question of Enoch. Noah is a righteous man. It's the reason that he did find favor in God's eyes, because he was a man of faith. And yet sacrifice is still the foundation of his relationship with God. And so the first thing he does when he comes out of the ark is offer that sacrifice. But go ahead, Marshall.
I just got a question that's related to your point here. Is that altar a kind of calling on the name of the Lord?
Well, I think what we find throughout, and we'll see this as we get into the story of Abraham, is that building an altar is a show of a sign of respect most of the time. Is that it's a claim of, I am your God, or you are my God, I am yours. And so yes, I mean, in some sense, I would say that's not a bad way of putting that. We'll see that with Abraham, we'll see that with Isaac, we'll see it with Jacob, and so that sort of theme will continue throughout the rest of this book.
And so in response to that sacrifice, God actually responds to that. And he does that in this text. He does that by offering a covenant, and so you have that. This is the first time Noah is the first time that you actually see the word covenant used in the entire Bible, and it is so clearly throughout all of Scripture. This is my covenant with you. This is my covenant with Abraham. This is my covenant with Isaac. This is my covenant with Jacob. This is my covenant with all of his sons. This is my covenant with Israel. This is my covenant with Moses. And you go on through the Old Testament, and he keeps coming back to, this is my covenant. And this is establishing that you must be faithful to the Lord because he is faithful to you. And so covenant relationship is the idea of him offering covenant salvation, and that's what he wants to offer, but of course the blood of bulls and goats cannot forgive sins. And so you have in Jeremiah 31 that it says that there is yet a covenant to come, that there will ultimately be forgiveness. And Jesus, of course, is the fulfillment of that idea of covenant, that this finally establishes a pure and final relationship between God and his people, that as they have desired to come to know God and they finally have that opportunity to come before him, and he has given them the opportunity to have a relationship with him, Jesus says, take this cup, this is the blood of my covenant, which is for you. And so he establishes that sacrifice must come before a covenant can be established. And so just in the same way that you have in the story here of Noah, that you have a sacrifice happens and God responds in covenant pleasure. He is pleased with that sacrifice and responds by saying, here's my covenant that I'm establishing with you. Jesus does the same thing. He says, here is my sacrifice that I'm giving myself, and now here is the covenant that you can be a part of. Well, the covenant that God made with Noah was specifically the rainbow in the sky. And it emphasized that God would never destroy the earth by water again, that he would never flood the earth to destroy it ever again. And some people, they miss that flooding part in that discussion, and they say, see, God's not going to destroy the earth. Well, that's not what he said. And in 2 Peter chapter 3, we see that he can destroy the world again, but he's not going to do it through water. He's going to do it through fire. And so you do see that that covenant has remained intact. And just as a side note, certainly is a beautiful covenant that we can still watch even today, that we get to experience rainbows and remember that God is faithful to his promises. Any questions that you guys got there before we move into the last section here? Okay. So we come to the discussion of Noah's offspring, and Marshall, I'm going to hand that off to you as we get started here.
Sure. Well, the second half of chapter 9 all the way through, chapter 11 reveal the post-flood events and really, pre-Abraham events. That's where it's working toward. We're kind of moving fast forward from the time of the flood to Abraham just about as fast as we can. But it does talk about the sin of Noah, his drunkenness, and then the associated sin of his son Ham that comes right after that. You have a genealogy that kind of, again, presses that fast forward button through the descendants of Noah, paving the way for the story of Genesis chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel. And then really the end of chapter 11 is another genealogy of Shem that is special focus toward Abram to get the story to the beginnings of the Jewish people. We've had in chapters 1 through 11, the beginnings of all the world. Now we're really zeroing in to get to the origins of the Jewish people. And so this part of the story really does move us in that direction. But just to kind of overview what happens in that sin of Noah is Noah, that blameless man, builds a vineyard and makes wine and gets drunk and winds up naked in his tent, and his son Ham commits some kind of sin against him, and then he is cursed along with his descendant Canaan. Now, I don't know exactly why I keep getting some of these curse sections. Thanks for that, Colton. But,
hey, I got the first one.
Yeah, you did. The sin of Ham. What is it? My simple answer would be I don't know. But can we move on from that? Now, but some assume that Ham simply witnessed and exploited his father's nakedness in some way. Others suggest that Ham performed some kind of sexual act against his father or maybe against his mother. There's all kinds of theories out there. Just to keep it general, I'd say somehow Ham clearly dishonored his father. And I think we're seeing in these initial stories a lot of the Ten Commandments without the Ten Commandments having been stated yet, or at least in the stories. And so the Israelites can look back and say, look at all these commands that our forefathers broke. And so you have him dishonoring his father, which again, that principle, sin leads to a curse. Sin leads to a curse, and that's exactly what happens. And this is not saying, at least in my mind, I don't think the scripture is saying that because Ham sinned, his descendants were guilty of his sin. But I do think that the consequences of his sin lasted, and all the more because Canaan, his son, and the Canaanites walk in their father's footsteps. They don't change. They are just as evil as their father in many ways. And that might have helped the original readers, the Israelites, as they are getting prepared for the conquest of Canaan, to know the backstory of their Canaanite relatives, if you will. But the principle holds true. Sin brings a curse, and it doesn't get better, because as you trace that through, you're going to get to the story of the Tower of Babel. Sin hasn't gotten better. And so let me hand that part of the story off. Maybe, Stephen, if you want to summarize that and make a couple of points there. It's not looking good even in this new creation post-flood.
Yeah. About halfway between Noah and our next section, as we look to Abram, there comes the population has increased significantly. We're several generations down the road from Noah, though they would have still been living as they're watching these things. Again, we've got long lifespans still on the table, and so they would have been watching this. And instead of spreading out and populating the earth, which is something that God had instructed Noah to do, they'd gathered together. And what it says that they wanted to do, it says, verse 4, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise we'll be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." And of course, God comes down and he frustrates those plans by confusing the languages of the people. If you look over into chapter 12, as we'll see, as we'll begin looking at next week, but one of the things that God says to Abram is in verse 2, "I will bless you and make your name great." God wanted to make Abram's name great, but here are people who wanted to make their own name great. God is not unwilling to make greatness of men, but he wants to be the source of the greatness. And when we are trying to be the source of the greatness, he aims to frustrate that. He confused the languages. We see another parallel over in Acts chapter 2. On the day of Pentecost, it tells us that there were people from every nation, from all the different languages and tongues. And there, the confusion is moved in the other direction as the apostles are given the ability to speak to all of those nations in a way that all of them are able to understand. And so there again, you have people coming together and God disperses them. And yet, on this other occasion, God is the one bringing them together. And again, I think the key is, who is it that's bringing them together? In our society, there is a constant refrain of, why can't we all come together? Let me just tell you, if it's not God bringing us together, we don't want all men to be together, because all that is more potential for more disaster. And men have proven that time and time again, that the more we come together, we share ideas and we come up with technology, wonderful. We come up with more and more ways to be brutal and terrible to each other. And so what God says is, yes, I want you to come together with me, with God as the focus. Other than that, there is purpose to keep man dispersed as far as God is concerned. So I think there's some lessons to be learned there in the Tower of Babel. Finally, as Marshall mentioned, we come into that genealogy to get us from Noah to the next section. And so why don't you take us out there, Colton?
And to some extent, this is just as a matter of a point of interest, as far as, what peoples went to what areas. But just from what we can tell from the names that are given, and perhaps if those names became the nations that surround those names, you have that Shem would have filled up the Arabian Peninsula and the Fertile Crescent and perhaps some parts of Asia as well. You have that Ham would have filled in all of Africa, and as well as the land of Canaan, of course, because you have that name Canaan, that who was cursed by God. And then you have Japheth, where basically everywhere else. And so Europe, Asia was spread across that area. And so the one that we really need to be concerning ourselves with, though, is Shem. We've heard of the term anti-Semitism, and that means hatred of Jewish people. And that emphasizes that Jewish people are descended from Shem, anti-Semitism. You have that word Shem being in that word. And so the Jews are the primary people that are going to be the foundations of their history, is where we're going to be focusing in for the rest of our time. And I'll hand that over to Marshall.
Yeah. And so we are running to the end of our time, but I'll just quickly preview. Next week, we're going to talk about Abraham. That's where the narrative goes at the end of chapter 11 into chapter 12. And we're going to continue through much of Abraham's life. I don't think we're going to cover all of it next week, but we'll get the beginnings of his faith, the covenant that God makes with him, among other aspects of Abraham's life and the promises of God that are made to him, especially about his son Isaac. So hope you can join us again next week as we talk about Abraham, the father of the faithful. We want to be his heirs. And so there's going to be a lot of tie-ins that we can make to the New Testament. You might think, this is just another Old Testament study. Old Testament is so important because without it, we can't understand the New Testament. If we want to understand our hope, we need to understand Abraham. And so next week, I hope you'll join us for that. Did you guys have any questions or comments on your end that we need to cover?
We're good here.
Yep.
Likewise. Right, well, then again, appreciate everyone being here tonight, and I hope we can see you again next week. And if you have any questions or comments, send us a private message, and we'll bring it up next week. So let us know if we can help you in your understanding as you help us in our understanding. We're all growing in our knowledge together, and here Genesis really helps us to know the foundations of our faith. And so I hope you'll come back next week. With that, we'll kind of sign out. I may, just because of the potential for lag, drop us down to just an intro page for a few seconds, but you're welcome to go ahead and either stay here, have a little chat, or just close out now. But we'll have about 20 seconds before we end the stream. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next week.